Welcome to the Meru Media podcast with Mukunda. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Meru Media podcast. I'm Mukunda Raghavan, and today we are joined by Dr. Edward Butler, who is a doctor, I think doctor of philosophy, especially focusing on kind of Hellenic and a little post-Hellenic concepts of polytheism, philosophy, and the tradition of Plato to basically, in some sense, the modern age and how we approach the philosophical underpinnings of polytheism and basically Plato's concept of forms and things of that nature. So, Dr. Butler, thank you and welcome to the podcast. How's your day going today?
Oh, pretty good. It's a little jackhammering out my window. Hopefully you can't hear it.
But, no, it's totally clear.
That's New York City for you.
Yeah. How are you doing with this COVID right now?
Okay. So far, so good, you know?
Yeah.
Just, staying in, basically, kind of what I did anyway, you know?
I mean, you are an intellectual. That's kind of what you do.
Yeah, exactly. It's not too much different.
Is the city okay? Are you able to navigate it with all the lockdown and everything?
Yeah, I think so. You know, I think that, New York City has been through a lot in 300 some odd years.
Right.
And, we're still going strong.
It does. I mean, I'll just bring up this point, then we can get into your background and everything. But I find it's interesting because, I mean, you study so much of the ancient world and, even into the Roman era. Plagues of this sort were pretty kind of regular. So I would imagine they dealt with it in similar kind of fashions.
Yeah, having a broader historical perspective does help sometimes.
Yeah.
With regard to a lot of things that might get a person down.
Right.
When you study late antiquity, I mean, pretty much everything that could be thrown at people back then was, and yet there were still people doing their work, doing outstanding intellectual work, living incredible, long, productive lives, even amidst unbelievable, mayhem and chaos.
Right.
So, I do draw a certain amount of inspiration from that myself.
Right. I don't think a lot of people know, even during the time of Socrates, right after the Peloponnesian War, there was quite a bit of plague hit the city because they were a kind of under siege for numerous years.
Pandemics were regular occurrences in antiquity.
Yeah. So jumping from modern age, let's get into your history. how you got to where you are. It is unique, especially in this world that's very dominated by, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, even the concepts of monotheism that are influence everything, even atheism in very significant ways. How did you make your journey into polytheism, and what was your background before and education?
Well, I was raised without any religion. And so I think that gave me an opportunity to experience all of it kind of without prejudices. Mm-hmm. And so when I was little, I read, Greek or Norse mythology, and I read, stuff from the Bible. And, I looked at it all the same way. I didn't see one as being, okay, this is true, or, more important, or, it was just all the same.
Right.
And I think that, as a small child, I was fascinated with mythology.
Correct.
It really spoke to me. And also, I think just with the images of ancient polytheistic civilizations, images from ancient Egypt, images from ancient India. And so I had that kind of sensibility that, of course, because I was a kid, wasn't really religious yet exactly.
Right.
And then at some point in late adolescence, that just sort of seemed to kind of naturally blossom into something more. And I became a committed polytheist. I became devoted to, first one deity and then, others along the way, because one of the things about polytheism is that far from being jealous gods, I think most polytheists will find that gods like having other gods around, and so, it's like it kind of disposes one to start to, offer devotion to others in various ways, through kinds of chains of association, through, practices that you come into contact with in everyday life, maybe through travel, various kinds of ways. And it was only later that I got into philosophy, because I sort of, I had a rather meandering path intellectually and sort of in terms of what I saw myself doing as a career. I saw myself as broadly a creative person and as very intellectual, but I didn't quite know the best outlet for that.
Right.
Then eventually, I discovered philosophy, and it was like, this is where I belong. This is where I can best use the talents that I have. And that happened to be at the New School for Social Research.
Right.
Which is a great place to study philosophy, very, very open to every different kind of approach. And at first, I didn't see my identity as a polytheist, my religious identity, as being necessarily directly related to what I was going to do philosophically, because I just didn't know really, was this really a point of view that had a place in philosophy? Because just like a lot of people, I didn't necessarily see that from the kind of presentation that was given of philosophy in secondary literature, But what really changed that for me was actually the summer before I started doing my coursework in philosophy at the New School.
Mm-hmm.
I sat down and read Proclus's Elements of Theology. And I was really struck by it, because I realized that, first of all, the way in which this philosophy was being presented in the kinds of commentaries and pre-digested presentations of it that I had encountered was completely different than what I was getting from it as a direct impact of actually reading the text. And, what I realized very quickly was this is a philosophy that is polytheistic to the core.
Right.
And that, the whole essence of it, the whole point of it is polytheism. And so pretty quickly I was like, wow, if this has been so little appreciated, this aspect of this philosophical approach has been so little appreciated, here's a project that certainly I could undertake.
Right.
And it was a little daunting because of the kind of philological demands that were going to be put upon me. But I was just beginning my coursework, and so it seemed like, well, okay, between now and when I have to actually write my dissertation, it should be enough time for me to accumulate the skills that I need. And so I pretty much set to work right on it. And the whole time that I was taking courses at the New School, they weren't necessarily about what I was writing on, but everything that I took was informing that, And as someone who studied philosophy yourself, I think, you kind of know how that is. You have particular interests, but once you've been taught to read philosophically, how to read philosophy like a philosopher, you can benefit from every philosopher that you read, and everything that you read feeds into your project. There's nothing that's just external to it. And so this was what I found during the time that I was at the New School, was just, everything that I was learning, the courses I was taking in Kant, in Hegel, in American pragmatists like Peirce, or Wittgenstein, it was all contributing to it. And so then when I finally sat down to write my dissertation, it just kind of all tumbled out.
Right. Wow. Okay. I mean, that's a kind of a, I don't like the word meandering, but it is, because you're kind of journeying through both the intellectual sphere and kind of a very...
There's nothing wrong with meandering.
No, I don't either. I mean, people find that word very negative, but I think it's a good way for a lot of philosophers to do that too. They meander through their thoughts to kind of parse them out, right? And that's kind of like
a philosopher who isn't meandering is doing something wrong, I think. I really do.
No, I agree. But I think that's a more analytical philosophy. They tend not to meander. They're just very. But no.
One of the nice things at the New School is that although it's a continental institution, in quotes, there's always a really sincere effort there to at least be open to, if not incorporate to some degree, analytic thought.
Sure.
And, some of my teachers did, really make an effort in that respect. And in terms of my specific sort of like subfield, I'll say this. I mean, sometimes analytic readings of Plato can be refreshing, because, there can be a smothering orthodoxy on the interpretation of Plato that comes from the continental side. And so, I found certain analytic approaches to Plato very rewarding. Mary Margaret McCabe's book, Plato's Individuals, Verity Hart's book, Parts and Wholes in Plato, they're both coming from an analytic perspective. And I think, really opening up some important perspectives that were severely neglected from the kind of continental approach.
Right. I mean,
also Patricia Curt's book on Parmenides, another example of that.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't read these authors, so now I have to put them onto my list to take a look at them. I remember when I read Heidegger, it was his assessment of philosophy from the time of Plato onwards was so negative in terms of how you viewed that they came about the text, right? Like,
well, that's because Heidegger's 9/10 a Christian theologian.
I agree with you. I did a paper in
my friend Joydeep, who Joydeep Bagchi, he has a lot of great stuff to say on that.
Yeah, because when I was studying Heidegger, it was in my master's program in philosophy. This is like when I was doing law school, which is interesting when I read about Proclus being a lawyer first and deciding this shit's not for me.
That's right.
I was like,
then Athena came to him.
Yeah, that's right.
Like, no.
No, and the wisdom of the law is kind of lacking.
You aim higher.
Yeah.
Aim higher.
It's funny because when I first became a lawyer, the reason I became a lawyer is I thought it was like philosophy and practice, and some elements are totally there, right? Like especially when you get into your rules.
Philosophy and law is a very interesting field,
right? I mean, J.L. Hart, Dworkin, all those guys, But my point was like, there's elements of even epistemology sitting in your rules of evidence, right? How to approach any sort of testimony or any sort of like any of these things. So I found that interesting, but a lot of the law practice ends up becoming more about social custom versus any sort of rigorous logic. And so I find philosophy gave me a better perch to really look at the world. And it is people think it's an easy or armchair kind of thing. And one of the things that always strikes me is philosophy requires a lot of self-introspection. I mean, and it requires a lot of looking at the world and trying to break it down to elements in which we can try to understand it the best way possible. And a lot of disciplines don't have that discipline to do that in that sense. So it is a very intellectually daunting task, and you coming to this place, especially in such a heterodoxical position in your polytheism is very, very reassuring in many senses that philosophy is still a lively place where the ideas, as different and as vast as can still exist and have a place to engage.
I agree with that. I mean, to some extent, of course, I think that it was nice not to be at an institution where the focus was squarely on ancient philosophy all the time, because I would have had to have a lot more arguments about my position.
Sure.
And so it was relaxing in a lot of ways to be sort of like the person who, he, in terms of what he does in his own stuff, he has this kind of abstruse project, but he has some interesting things to say every now and then about Hegel too.
Sure.
But at the same time, I mean, I think that the kind of institution that I was at, there was this kind of openness that, people, people were aware that I was a polytheist. I was quite open about it. I wasn't like, hiding it or anything. People, the general attitude would be, well, that's a little weird, but also interesting. Let's hear what kind of a perspective that gives them.
So, like, when you decided to become a polytheist, I mean, it's always difficult to say that.
Back when I was like, I don't know, like 17 or something.
Right. But I always find it interesting because people think like these are decisions in some sense, but they're really kind of more of like you've gotten there and like emotionally kind of got there also.
It's kind of more like, I mean, for me, it was just kind of like, I kind of got grabbed.
Right. So looking back on it, what in particular really drew you to that position?
Well, I mean, if I'm going to be honest, I mean, I think that I had been going through a period of being what people somewhat tritely characterize as a seeker.
Yeah.
And so, I was looking into a lot of things. But then, I had a dream, and there was a goddess in it.
Mm-hmm.
And
Parmenides, huh?
It just kind of, it made such an impact on me that it's not like I was gonna it's not like I was gonna drop that thread.
Right.
So, I mean, I pretty much just went right in.
And that sounds so much like Parmenides, right? When he meets.
Well, yeah, I think it's funny, people who have a devotional life,
right,
and particularly the kind of devotional life that polytheists do, where a god can come over the transom, so to speak,
sure,
at any time.
Right.
Parmenides' poem speaks to me in a certain way, particularly because of the things that the goddess says right at the beginning to him,
mm-hmm.
where she says, if I could paraphrase basically,
sure,
don't be afraid, you're not dead.
Right.
Which, I mean, I think has such the kind of ring of truth to it. There is something so beautiful about the way in which living immortals engage with mortal beings. There is an infinite care, an infinite gentleness,
right?
Because we are such fragile beings,
right?
And that's the beauty of us,
right?
That's the beauty of us for them, and I think you really see it in that moment where Parmenides' goddess is reassuring him. I know this is all a bit much for you,
right?
But she says, it's no bad turn of fate that,
right,
brings you here, which, I interpret to mean is really just basically, it's okay,
Right.
you're not dead.
No, I mean, that entire dialogue to me, when I read it years ago,
it has the absolute marks of a genuine first-person theophany.
Absolutely.
It's not at all a literary device, in my opinion. I think that it is as accurate a record as he could manage.
And we don't even have the full text
of what he
anyway.
Experienced.
And we only have fragments of his text also, right?
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to I would assume to build a sort of literary framework with only parts of a text anyway. So
and that creates a lot of problems in terms of understanding the philosophical import.
Right.
But also, if we recognize the validity of the first person theophany, that also changes the whole perspective in terms of the philosophical import, because we realize that Parmenides is there trying to figure out the philosophical import of it as well.
Right.
It's not just us.
Right.
He's also trying to figure out what is the significance of this.
Right, because especially in the terms of the path of truth and the path of doxa, right? So
it's amazing how few commentators on this text will even take a moment to consider the possibility that he is also struggling.
Right.
This is what if this is just as it was presented to him? And so people will say, well, how do these two paths fit together and stuff? What if he's right there trying to figure that out as well?
I mean, when I read it, that's what I got from it. That while the goddess is saying this, he's having this difficulty trying to understand what does it mean in our world. How do we approach this?
Sure.
And he wasn't laying out a full philosophy of thought. He was laying out what was told to him and trying to figure that out as he's going along.
And he's going to spend the whole rest of his life unpacking this.
Right.
And I mean, that's the way that it often is.
A lot of people say all of philosophy is a footnote to what Socrates or Plato. I actually, in some sense, think all of Western philosophy is a footnote to Parmenides in many ways.
Well, I mean, Plato, the things that he says about Parmenides, Socrates, famously says, I prefer to think if there's something I see in Parmenides I don't agree with, I prefer to think that I'm just not understanding him right.
Right. I mean,
which, the hermeneutic of charity is a very important principle, and I think too little observed by moderns.
I agree. I mean, there's a few people out there I think do try, at least in lip service and in some sense try, like Sam Harris I think tries sometimes, and there's a few other people that try it, but they only do it within a certain context. And they're not able to do it. Like if we were to talk about religion in some sense, they won't give it the principle of charity and assume that we're talking about actual real experiences.
When it comes to philosophers and the gods, charity goes out the window. I mean, the article that I wrote, Plato's Gods and the Way of Ideas,
right?
Which you could say really just has the very simple premise that we might try taking seriously what Plato says about the gods, most notably in the Phaedrus.
Right.
A pretty modest thesis. It's already surprising, given the voluminous secondary literature on Plato, that nobody had advanced it before. But journal after journal rejected the piece, and reviewers essentially said simply, this is too much even for me to entertain as a thought experiment, that Plato took these gods seriously.
Right.
It's just too much. And I mean, some of the reviewers were honestly confused. They were like, I don't understand the purpose of this thought experiment. I don't know where he's coming from. Why is he even doing this? It's so weird. It's from out of left field. I just can't see the point of it. Eventually after I don't know how many tries, I found a journal that was willing to publish it. But I mean, I think it's extremely instructive that, just to take at face value
right
what such a philosopher says. And I mean, the statements of piety to the traditional Olympian gods are all through Plato.
Right.
And they're all through Socrates in,
absolutely.
In Xenophon.
Well, a part of this, I think, is a tradition of over time, both the Judaic sources and the Christian sources trying to take Plato, Aristotle,
Sure.
and Socrates and appropriate them within their intellectual framework, right?
Yeah.
And in the process, you kind of have to say, if they believed in many gods, then obviously they can't be part of the same lineage as we do. They must have only believed in like one universal God, and everything else was just like things they said, or they didn't really mean it. It was a metaphor. So which I think is it's a very dishonest thing to do about the original sources, because I mean, I think it's Timus, where he talks about the descent of the soul from the realm of the heavens. Is that Timus?
Yeah.
And then he goes into how the soul ends up reincarnating because of all this stuff. He's talking about a place where the gods exist, and that the soul is once a god, right? So he clearly has a sense that the divinities exist in some regard. And I mean,
sure. Yeah. I mean, he's very, he's quite open about this in so many places. I mean, it's even in the laws, it's even a crime not to believe in the gods.
Right, which is why Socrates gets killed.
Well, no, I mean, not really, because, I mean, first of all, the idea in his prosecution is that he's introducing a new God.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
By which, of course, they mean his personal daimon that he claims, advises him, although, rather laconically, just by dissuading him from things. But Socrates defends himself, of course, very spiritedly. And I mean, throughout Plato's writings, we see so many, moving indications of Socrates' piety. He speaks of himself as a slave of Apollo.
Right.
He speaks of the gods as his masters. He speaks of philosophers as, following in the wake of Zeus.
Sure.
It just, I mean, he speaks of having consulted priests and priestesses to get their perspective on, the philosophical implications of what they do.
Right.
And he takes what they say very seriously. We see this in the Meno. And also, of course, in the Symposium, where one of these priestesses is even adduced by him specifically as a teacher. We can go on and on.
Yeah.
And the question is simply, why was there this construct created with respect to Plato? Which had far-reaching philosophical implications, even if we put aside the issues regarding religion and the kinds of dispositions of power that were involved with that. There are far-reaching philosophical implications if we take philosophical concepts like the one in Plato. If we take these no longer in their philosophical significance, but we take them strictly as being ciphers for a religious position, then, one of the major consequences is that we blow a hole in the whole philosophical fabric.
Sure.
And with respect to the doctrine of the one, we lose the philosophical significance of the principle of individuation. And the major, one of the major distinguishing aspects of the Platonic school in antiquity was that they adduced a principle of individuation distinct from being.
Can you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, I say and it's like, okay, well, this is going to get a little complicated, but Fools rush in where angels fear to tread, and let's include philosophers along with the fools. Okay, I mean, in essence, when Plato speaks of the one, okay, we ought to understand this more or less the same way that we understand it when he talks about other ideas. You know, what's the cause of things being beautiful? Beauty.
Right.
You know, this is the kind of answer that Socrates in the Phaedo talks about as being safe.
Right.
You know, rather than going out on a limb and risking a reductionistic answer to important questions, Socrates says, you know what? I've learned that you start out with a safe answer. One that doesn't lead us into reductionism. Right. Because he wasn't impressed with what the philosophers who came before him had done, because they were always reducing intelligible phenomena to causes that were of a grosser character. And so he was like, you know, and this is the essence of what's called what he calls his second sailing, when he sets forth again to do philosophy better. He starts out with these safe answers. If someone asks me, you know, why are things beautiful? I'm going to say, first and foremost, because of beauty. You know, and then, you know, we're going to flesh it out from there.
Right.
It's not that he comes in with this whole worked out theory of forms or something.
Sure.
The initial move is just to avoid this kind of reductionism. And so, just like all of these other kinds of answers, well, what makes each thing one thing? The one. Unity, you know. And this is always the kind of way that the one, or unity, is deployed in Greek thought. It's always about, well, this thing is one thing.
Right.
You know, from what does its unity come? From what does, you know, what makes it hold together as one thing? And so what's important to recognize, first of all, with respect to the way in which this philosophy is often presented to us today, is that, first of all, it's not about, hey, there's this one
right
out there. Okay. You know, that's pretty transparently just the kind of games that the church played, the Prisca Theologia, you know, this kind of idea that, oh, well, you know, Plato and Aristotle, because they have stuff that we want to appropriate, we're going to say that they had this kind of privileged private revelation of our God, and, you know, this made them okay. You know, they're not in hell. They're in limbo with the unbaptized babies and stuff. You know, I can't imagine that's very fun. But whatever. You know,
that's only the Catholics, by the way, not you know, not the Orthodox.
Well, yeah. You know. Well, yeah, I mean, you know, attitudes toward Plato vary greatly. I mean, it's interesting that in the West, where his works were lost for such a long time, he's a kind of a fairy tale figure in the Middle Ages. There's a much friendlier reception than in the Greek Orthodox context, where, like, they still have his works, and you know, they're aware of all the kinds of things that they don't like about it. They have a much more ambivalent attitude toward him. But okay, so I mean, so it's not about this spooky one out there, you know, but it's also not about everything is one thing.
Right.
You know, because I mean, that just simply, that wouldn't get to the epistemological problem.
Right.
You know, the problem that they're interested in is, you know, what makes this thing one thing? You know, what makes this cow one cow? What, you know, how does unity work? And that's why they say, in the tradition of these kinds of safe opening bid kind of answers, well, you know, each thing is one because of unity, because of the one. So what is the nature of this principle then? How does it work? That's then what we get into in the kind of more developed doctrine of Platonism. And this is a notably distinct answer than what we get, say, in Aristotle, who, although he's coming out of the Platonic tradition, and in many ways is himself a Platonist.
Yeah.
Lloyd Gerson has a great book, Aristotle and Other Platonists. Certainly in antiquity, he was considered to be a Platonist who had these kinds of very important critiques that by answering them, Platonism became deeper and stronger and more responsive to the kinds of questions that were important to them both.
So let me
for Aristotle, just to sort of wrap up this line of thought briefly, for him, he doesn't really like that the Platonists have a distinct principle of individuation. He feels like that's otios. He feels like being can just be the source of individuation for things. And that's one of the major differences between Aristotle and the other Platonists, as you can see from the fact that he ends the Metaphysics with two books, M and N, which aren't read very much today, interestingly. People tend to stop with book Lambda.
Mm-hmm.
The Metaphysics ends with these two books that are basically, about refuting the Platonists on the one and related matters. Because this really is the kind of key question for him, as a Platonist.
Right.
What is the source of unity for things?
So along this line, in Indian philosophy, in various Samkhya and Yoga and all these, they have a causation based upon either Satyakadavada, which is like the change is real, or Asatyakadavada, which is it's not real. There's no actual change occurring. And there's the last one, it's called Vivartavada, which is it's only appearance. So from the one to become to ones, is that a real thing, or is it? I understand in the Platonic dialogue, it is much more the forms, and then you have these things, kind of some sort of a mirroring of the two. But how would you conceptualize it?
Okay, well, I mean, in Plato's Parmenides, which for later Platonists was taken to be the dialogue par excellence, where we really get into the question of unity, the nature of unity as such. The way in which later Platonists read the second part of that dialogue, where Parmenides and this boy Aristoteles, ironically has the same name as Aristotle, but
not him.
Sadly not him, unfortunately. It'd be great if it was, but no.
Yeah.
Parmenides gives him an example of the practice of dialectic by doing this dialectical inquiry into the nature of unity. And the way in which later Platonists read this is that each successive hypothesis, because it unfolds a different conceptualization of unity. If unity is the ultimate principle of things, then each of these hypotheses is actually unpacking the constitutive mode of unity for some plane of being. And so what you're getting is like a map of the cosmos, a map of being.
Yeah.
Through these different conceptions of unity. And so in terms of the question of, how do we get from the one to ones?
Yeah.
I mean, what is most striking about the first hypothesis of the Parmenides is that we end up with something completely negative as an entity in itself. The one in the first hypothesis, which is considered most strictly with regard to all of the characteristics of unity, we end up with something that neither is nor is one.
Right.
And so the one as something can't be anything if it's going to do what it needs to do for everything else. And so the principle of individuation, precisely in order to do what it needs to do the work that it's being posited for, can't be also individuating itself as something.
And that's the point
and
of
so,
Platonism,
in a way, we don't have to have that transition.
Right. So
because we're just answering the question. We're just answering the question with respect to the individuation of all of these things around us.
So, and this is I think something you bring up in one of your books, that between, and we'll get into the gods particularly later, but because they come either a little bit after or kind of right around the time of the one. I mean, if you can use time in whatever context that, but what is the relation between the one and the ones then? Because if they don't have the necessary physical chain of causation, then what would be that relation?
Well, I mean, we're not talking about physical entities necessarily to begin with.
Sure, you're right.
We're not talking about, even in terms of physical entities, we're not necessarily talking about them qua physical, because the unity of something qua physical entity is going to be a different matter than the unity of something qua form. And there might even be a mode of unity for things that goes beyond form.
Sure.
Because of course we have the problem of unique particulars.
Right.
And that's ultimately where the gods come in, through the question of the unity of absolutely unique things. If we could think such things, what would be the nature of unity that they would possess? That's how we then get to the gods, because we're not, first of all, approaching them as some class of being, but we're approaching them as the ultimate entities.
Right.
And therefore, we're looking at, from a question of unity, what is the unity of absolutely unique things in the first place?
Right.
And for later Platonists, because I mean, of course, we don't know what the kind of discussions were within the academy very well, because, the first couple of generations of the academy, they're represented just by a real paucity of fragments, But we know that already there was some kind of a discourse about what later in Platonists like Proclus are called henads, units. And the sense of this is absolutely unique individuals.
Right.
The primary products of the principle of individuation, simply because they are primarily unique. And basically, between the first hypothesis of the Parmenides, in which we have the absolute negativity of the principle of individuation itself, and the second hypothesis of the Parmenides, where we have the unity of being, which is which just accepts all determinations, even contradictory ones.
Right.
Basically, between these two, you could say, is where the gods, the henads, are located. Or we could simply say that they're there in the first hypothesis because the one, as something distinct from them, isn't.
Right.
And so we could simply say that that's where they are, because with each negation that is applied to the one in that first hypothesis, each of those for Proclus represents then a positive determination of the activity of some class of gods.
Okay.
And so what you're getting is an unfolding of being through the activity of classes of gods who, in effect, by withholding themselves in the kind of negativity of not being determined by ontic determinations, by that very force of repulsion, you could say, are producing these ontic determinations as spaces that beings then can participate.
Sure. So I mean, let me see if I can simplify it down for people that don't understand these things like
Yeah,
ontic,
it's
and
complicated.
it's complicated, right? Because I mean, we're talking at some level in a conception where physicality doesn't exist and time doesn't exist. It's more of a it's I would call it loosely conceptual because it's very tough to even think about things like
It's a
this, right?
conceptual analysis,
Yeah,
I mean, it's like there's no harm, I think, in looking at it, because I think a lot of damage has been done to the interpretation of Platonism by people getting too spooky with it,
right,
too mystical with it.
right.
And you have this whole kind of tradition of negative theology that's in part at least built up around Plato's Parmenides and the negations applied to the one,
Which it
where
too.
it doesn't have to be anything spooky. We can really just see this as a kind of conceptual analysis.
Right, which is the same difficulty you have when you talk about Brahman in the Upanishad sense, or in the
Absolutely.
Upanishads, right, where they say,
Yeah,
not this, not this, is he's not,
that's right.
what you can only talk about in the negative. He's not death, but can you say he's a life? No, you can't, because he's something that's not death. We don't know what that entirely is. So
Exactly.
in that
Exactly.
sense, yeah,
And the challenge is to think along with this,
right,
to think along with this. And if you do, then, you get guided along to framing a more adequate conception of things than the everyday conception that you walked in with.
right. I mean, in some sense, like, we do this in regular life anyway, right? Like, but the difference is we have reference points in our mind. If you say this is a tree, what is that over there? Then that's not a tree, right? But we're only talking about it in reference to something else. And the difference here is the difficulty of having the vastness of something be limited. I mean, when you say something's not this, there's still a vastness that you're saying that it can be. So there's
Yeah.
this realm of possibility that exists that doesn't articulate it definitely, but maybe that's the point, is because we just can't know completely what it is. But in that sense, my other question would be, so from a monotheistic perspective, people will come to this and be like, well, how do you have so many of these different entities that are basically boundless in some sense, and coexisting together? Is there not a different clash of wills? Is there not a different clash of ideas or thoughts? And you bring this up in your book and one of your articles, but I kind of want you to explain kind of how the one exists along with, again, with the Henads, or the gods, in some relation. Not even relation, because that's one of the big things about the gods, right? They're
Well,
not
yeah,
relational.
the one really doesn't enter into it in a lot of ways,
Right.
because, if you want to ask the question of, how do, the gods having different, different will and
Sure.
different agency, not end up at odds with one another or something,
Yeah.
that's not a question actually which even requires bringing in something like a reified one itself.
Sure.
If you did, that wouldn't answer the question. And that's so often it's kind of the case that, like, people will bring in an entity like this, like
Mm-hmm.
a reified one itself.
Right.
And I mean, the term reified, if people aren't familiar with it, just means making something into a thing.
Right.
From the Latin race, a thing.
Right.
It's like making something into a thing that we don't actually have to think of as something. So a lot of times the questions that bringing in a reified one itself is supposed to answer, they actually aren't illuminated by it at all, even. It's just that it's been traditional to bring that in at a certain point.
Mm-hmm.
To bring that onto the stage and act like that makes the question easier. But I mean, the entire history of Western philosophy post the point at which it became monotheist shows that actually these problems don't get any easier from the introduction of that. And so the idea that somehow, we had to introduce this in order to deal with these kinds of problems really doesn't come into play. So, I mean, what we actually need to be asking in terms of the question that you just brought up
Mhm.
is, well, okay, you have many beings, how can they be at peace with each other? Is that a problem? Well, it's not a given that they're not. And
Right.
this is why Socrates expresses a certain skepticism with regard to at least a literal interpretation of myths of theomachy, because a conflict among the gods,
Yeah.
because it's interesting that people will often say, well, if he doesn't believe in theomachy, then he must not believe in the gods at all, which is a peculiar notion. I mean, if we walk in with the presupposition that a multiplicity of beings are inherently going to be at each other's throats, okay, well, that's a pretty Hobbesian sort of presupposition,
That's right.
to smuggle in. I think that generally the Platonic answer is that, maybe beings like gods are a little bit less disposed to be at each other's throats than entities like us that have a lot to lose on the one hand, and on the other hand also have a lot of factors obscuring
Right.
our recognition of what's actually good for us.
Sure.
Given that it would be better to, be able to just appreciate the beauty in one another, which is what we see the gods doing in Plato, in the Phaedrus, where, they gather together at their symposium, at their banquet, and just enjoy one another's company. I mean,
Yeah.
It's a simple but a fairly radical concept. They simply enjoy one another's company. They appreciate one another. And in the Timaeus, you see one god, the demiurge,
Right.
who, beholding the beauty of another god, the paradigm, is moved and inspired by it to give order to as much as he can of other things that he knows aren't going to be able to necessarily live up to the same kind of way of being that he enjoys, but he's gonna go as far as he can in terms of imparting this to other things. He's gonna try to create as many opportunities out of the stuff of the cosmos for things to participate to whatever degree they can in this kind of just beauty of appreciating one another.
Right.
The beauty of living things, of animals in the widest possible sense.
Sure.
Just living things, appreciating the beauty of other things as living things.
Right.
That, we can just be with one another in this beauty.
Which is,
that's the message. It's very simple, but I think extraordinarily powerful.
it's both those things, but it's also very interesting to me that, this conception apparently is so hard for people to think about, but when they think about, say, heaven and life after death, that's easy to think about. Everyone living harmoniously together, being together. But I mean, the difference there is, again, they did the same thing that you said is a problem. They're regulated by the one because they bring in the God in that sense that kind of regulates them, right? But doesn't take the problem away.
That's the thing. It's like if you need some kind of cop out there to keep you from each other's throats, then I mean, there's no point anyway.
And then is there a cop for that cop? Is there a cop for that?
Right. I mean, I mean, it's like, at the point that you say that it's impossible, apparently, for beings to just be with one another, and not be at each other's throats, then if that's your presupposition, the discussion is kind of over right from the start. If that's just the nature of things, if that's a fixed presupposition,
Sure.
then, it's like informal logic. Students are always like baffled when like you teach them F equals T. F entails T. From something false, you can infer anything. It's
right.
like, well, once you've taken as your presupposition that this is the nature of multiplicity, then, the discussion in a very meaningful sense is over. And,
right.
The same thing goes in terms of the ontology of individuals. I think one of the most grievous consequences of the repression of the doctrine of the one in Platonism as a principle of individuation is that when individuality, uniqueness, difference, alterity, plurality becomes really urgently thematic in philosophy in the later 19th and throughout the 20th century. Because of the repression of the Platonic doctrine with respect to a principle of individuation, this whole question is taken up in the mood of an anti-metaphysical train of thought. And so, people are convinced that in order to think about individuality, difference, plurality, alterity, you must be thinking beyond metaphysics, because metaphysics is just about the reduction of the many to the one, of the different to the same. And so, all of the kinds of movements that are thinking about these problems chiefly see themselves as being post-metaphysical. Existentialism, various postmodernisms, they all see themselves as being post-metaphysical precisely because of this. And so you can see from that, even if you didn't give a damn about religious questions, the profound effects for philosophy then of the kind of repression of this philosophical doctrine, where even if it's a thin account, because I could see people down the line being like, oh, okay, so they got a principle of individuation, but maybe it's a thin account. All right, well, let's have that discussion then. That's fine. But at least the whole notion that we have to break out of metaphysics in order to actually be talking about individuality and uniqueness and multiplicity as absolute phenomena, and not some kind of just epiphenomena, not just like some kind of the steam off the spaghetti or something.
I mean, that's an interesting point, because I think the Upanishads in some sense make the same thing, which is they'll say something like satyasya satya, which is the truth among the truth. It doesn't negate all the truths that are out there. It might be the unity of that, the oneness among all ones. It's a similar way of saying it, of having this position that even if you have all this difference and variety and multiplicity and you don't just reduce it to one, because you don't kind of negate the existence and the reality of those things and just say it's just one, as if they're a mass and this is one. There's so much variety in between that they actually have this dance or interplay or kind of this.
And by the same token, it's not like we're saying that there isn't sameness, that there isn't identity, that there aren't. The whole point of talking about principle of individuation is that it's not atomizing. You're not saying either that, there's just particulars and not universals. No, the point is that there's universals and there's particulars. They exist in different ways. And the whole point is to understand this, not to say that anything doesn't exist. I like to tell people sometimes when they ask me, like, well, what's Platonism in a nutshell? I like to say Platonism is the doctrine that everything exists. I don't say it's a doctrine of forms, because actually, that's not how it was presented in antiquity.
Sure.
The essence of Platonism is that everything exists. What we ask is how.
Which is really, I mean, this is obviously, I mean, you've read so much Indian thought too. This is very different from someone like Shankara.
Well,
right?
I'm still just a student with respect to that, and I mean the Indian tradition is dauntingly complex, and I think the beautiful thing about it is the subtlety of it.
Sure.
And the way in which every different side of a question is considered somewhere.
Right. In some system, right? Exactly.
It's an incredibly powerful system, and I mean, my level of engagement with it is still just that of really, I mean, just a beginning student.
Yeah, I mean, once you delve into any tradition, it's just it's vast. I mean, the Greek tradition is incredibly vast too. I mean, it's not just
the Indian tradition is more vast.
Yeah, that's true.
It's like I mean, I think that I can say, as someone who has looked a bit, into Indian philosophy and knows quite a bit about Western philosophy.
Yeah.
I think I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that Indian philosophy is more complex and probably more profound. People are going to get upset with me about this, but more profound in terms of having the flexibility, I think, to deal with every kind of issue. Well, I think that there's a bit more flexibility there.
Sure.
There's a bit more articulation of the concepts, and that's why I think it's so important to get to get the pollution out of the kind of process of comparison between West.
And so that's one of the things I try to avoid, is doing a comparison on equal footing. I like to do kind of like they exist together in some sense, and we have to look at where their thoughts align, where they disagree, and not saying this is better, that's worse, and they have a better position on this, because they approach it from different ways. I mean, and that's why I tend to say you can't talk about. I assume if philosophy is approaching the truth and the truth is universal, that every tradition has its own way of approaching that truth and understanding it and kind of grappling with it. And sometimes they find similar ways to grapple. Sometimes they find different ways to grapple. We just have to, if it's the truth, it's the truth, and it exists in a variety of forms for everyone.
Yeah, and I mean, also, there's no harm in saying also that truth is something produced.
Sure. Yes.
It's like, it's not, it's not necessarily a deflationary point, as I think it's often taken. It's like, okay, either truth is something that we just find.
Yeah,
and
you're right.
There, and no one has touched it. It's like, it's hermetically sealed.
Right.
With due acknowledgement to Hermes. There. I mean. Or if it's produced, it must mean that, well, it's just power, and it's something reductionistic. But I mean, it's like, truth really is something that's produced, but that doesn't make it less true.
Right.
And I mean, from my point of view, the fact that there are multiple truths and not, one sort of capital T truth and lots of little t truths.
Right.
The fact that there are many capital T truths isn't actually a relativist point.
Sure.
Because if you understand that truth is not something separate from the labor of existence,
right,
then you understand that just as there's this multiplicity of beings, through the labor of existence, they're producing truth.
Now, couldn't you say just like the one is the one and there's ones, there's T, truth is there and there's many T's?
Sure.
Yeah.
Just by virtue of the fact that we can talk about something true.
Right.
It's like, I think that a lot of times people don't appreciate that Platonism is very flexible because a lot of its answers are very thin. I mean, it's not for nothing that Socrates talks about these as safe answers.
Right.
because it's kind of like the Hippocratic Oath.
Sure.
First, do no harm.
Right.
You know,
What does that
first,
mean?
let's not distort phenomena
Right.
by not setting them off initially in their distinctness and saying, okay, there are beautiful things. So what is beauty?
Right.
There are things that are true. So what is truth?
Right.
We're not necessarily presupposing by positing that a certain account, it doesn't necessarily commit us to a certain account about what truth is.
No, and I think that's so important.
It's just the opening bid. But we know that truth is something simply because we can speak about truth.
Right.
We don't just have to say such and such proposition is true.
Sure.
We can say there is such a thing as truth, which is a property of these things that are true. Let's dialectically inquire into the nature of different things that are true and try to understand what is truth by seeing how it works.
Right.
This concept works.
And it's very similar to the Jain tradition, which talks about Syatvad, right? The idea of so they have the regular logic that we all have, the is not, but they also have logic that's in between that says maybe is and is not, right? And they go into so they have seven different versions that basically trying to encapsulate as much knowledge or truth or whatever you want to call it as we conceivably can without denying positions.
Exactly.
In entirety, right? So I mean,
sometimes Platonism has been referred to as conciliatory eclecticism, which I think is kind of apt because you try to conciliate all of these kinds of positions. And this is why they ended up being so successful within the framework of Western antiquity, incorporating the insights of other schools and kind of being the last one standing. Because they could look at what Stoics said, for instance, or what Aristotelians said, and say, with respect to this particular family of problems, this is a legitimate response, and if we don't overgeneralize this structure, then actually, we can incorporate it as being relevant to this particular body of problems, this particular family of questions.
Right. I mean, it's telling that it's lasted, now we're looking at 2,500 years, the entire school of Platonic thought, right? And it's still going strong.
Yeah, I mean, mutatis mutatis. I mean, it's had its ups and downs. But I mean, I think that the reach of it has been extraordinary, especially if you take into account certain things that aren't always considered to be Platonism per se. Like, I mean, if we look at somebody like Leibniz.
Spinoza even.
If we think of him as a Platonist, then, we can see his insights in binary logic, which have been so important for computation, his insights in terms of the calculus. And see them as being, in some sense, a further outgrowth of the Platonic tradition. Or we could take somebody like Giordano Bruno, who, when the new astronomy of Copernicus came out, his response wasn't to bury his head in the sand, but to embrace it immediately and say, just as the Platonic intelligible cosmos is acentric or polycentric, which is something that he perceived because of his inherent philosophical acumen. So too, it looks like the physical universe is this way too. And so he was ready to accept that. He wasn't thrown by it. He wasn't fazed by it. He wasn't defending some crumbling dogma. Rather, his exposure to Platonic thought more than anything else
Right.
was responsible for him being able to engage with that new empirical knowledge,
Right.
and incorporate it immediately. And I mean, so far in advance of, others who, were still kind of grudgingly coming to terms with it, a century or two later.
Sure.
Someone like him, because of his exposure to Platonism, was able to take this empirical knowledge and not put a straitjacket on it, not put some kind of an ideological interpretation on it right away,
Right.
but to be open to what it had to say, and catch up with it.
Right. Right. Absolutely. So I want to jump onto a topic I think is very fascinating to me, and I think a lot of my listeners, who are a good amount, are Hindus and a few other different religions, but mostly I think it's Hindus and Indians. But they tend not to know, and I love the Neoplatonist concept of emanations and the flow. Could you kind of explain that? And because I think it's so similar in some sense to Samkhya, I think it'll be interesting to think about it.
Yeah, I mean, when it becomes a question of like, matching up.
I don't want to match it. I just want to understand
Indian schools of thought. I mean, It's like, my principle is always just, I don't want to presuppose anything, because I think that different aspects of a number of different schools, I mean, there's a lot that I read in Vedanta which, resonates with me as a Platonist. But I mean, to speak about emanation, it's funny because people associate the term emanation very much with Platonism, and yet it's not necessarily a term that Platonists really use per se. There are terms that you could translate as emanation, but they're not necessarily used that much, or they're used in very particular kinds of contexts.
Sure.
But what the Platonists do talk about is, I mean, especially the later Platonists, they talk about procession.
Yeah.
They talk about the procession of being. And procession, in the most basic sense, is really just what we read off from our concepts.
Mm-hmm.
What a concept presupposes as its own elements or constituents are what that concept comes forth from a Platonic point of view. And so much of Platonic metaphysics is just getting the logic right.
Mm-hmm.
It's really just, so much of it, a careful conceptual analysis that says, this concept has as its presuppositions these other concepts, and therefore these other concepts are ontologically prior to it. And, this is what constitutes Platonic so-called idealism.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, in many ways, it's just a precondition for organizing our thought.
Yeah.
I mean, Parmenides, if you're going to see him as sort of the fountainhead of the Western tradition, he says thinking and being are one. Or, maybe a slightly more accurate translation of the Fragment is, the same thing is for thinking and as a being.
Right.
As being. And so getting our thoughts straight, understanding the order of implication of concepts, is the precondition for getting our engagement with the world straight. And so I would say that, Platonic emanation, the sort of emergence of one principle of being from prior ones, can in a way, again, be approached in too spooky a manner.
Right.
Because it's really about conceptual implication. And so, I mean, the simplest way to understand the presence of a principle of individuation prior to being is that we could say, well, even if something doesn't exist, it's one thing.
Right.
And so even if, the philosophers will talk about something like, a nonsense word like Glittery, or they'll talk about like a goat stag,
Right.
Even if something like that doesn't exist, it's still one thing.
Right.
And so just by virtue of that very simple kind of epistemic insight, we recognize that there's a certain daylight between being and unity.
Right.
And so too, with the further principles of being, the procession of being, it goes in the most developed form, from the one to being to, in Proclus, life, then intellect, and then soul, and then nature and body. It's basically about a system of descending conceptual implication.
Right.
And so, if we start from the bottom, embodied things, they're complex. There's a lot of presuppositions involved in our immediate perception of them. And so if we just start to take stock of those in a carefully ordered way,
right,
and deal with what's implied by something, but doesn't in itself imply that thing, implies more than that thing, has a wider conceptual scope,
right,
we actually move up a kind of a chain of what they call hypostases.
Right.
And we get ultimately to the first principle, which is unity, simply because nobody can think of anything
higher,
that has a wider applicability.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, that makes total sense. I mean, it does. I mean, I don't want to do comparison, but it does remind me very much of the way Samkhya thinks about procession too, in that sense, right? Like coming from the Purusha down to nature, to the self, it's all about how what comes from what, right? Like, what causes your ability to have intellect, your ego, right? And then so it goes from ego, intellect, mind, the senses, and all that stuff. So it's a very similar progression of being in the world and engaging in the world.
Sure. Yeah. And it's because it's arising from the same kind of ordered process of reflection.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, we sit down and we start to think about things in an ordered way.
Right.
And when we do that, we create these chains.
Sure.
And if you really give due weight to the significance of that process, then you realize that those chains, they're not just in our minds, because they're the possibility for the conception of anything that we might encounter. And so if you give the full cosmogonic weight to those chains,
right,
and if you give the full dignity to that process, that ordered process of reflection,
that's right,
then you realize that it's cosmogonic in itself. And this is why you get this extraordinary respect, which I think is one of the most powerful things in the Indian traditions that I read, this extraordinary respect for thinkers, for rishis,
right,
for the person who attempts to order their mind, because there is something cosmogonic just in that effort.
Right.
and it's there even for the person who doesn't get very far in it, because it's participating in that effort of giving order to the cosmos.
Right.
And this is how you get this kind of notion that people are somehow cooperating in the very cosmogonic work of the gods themselves.
Right.
By engaging in this, because when we're trying to make sense of the cosmos, it's not just something that's for us.
Right. It's for
by
the cosmos.
definition, it's giving order to the things themselves as well.
Right. So, which is, I mean, I'm not sure if you know much about that on the Greek side or the ancient Hellenic side, but that's the whole point of the Vedic yajna on the Indian side, right? It is to engage in the same process that the gods themselves are constantly engaging in, even at a microcosmic level, to affect the macrocosmic and vice versa.
Yeah.
So,
and think about how much more poignant an appreciation we have of this process if we don't presuppose that it's all already done
right
by something else. If we understand that us in our mode of being, the gods in their mode of existence,
right.
are actually by their very activity holding all this together,
right,
bringing it together, instead of presupposing that there's nothing to do because everything just is one. Understanding that the unity that we can perceive in all things, and sure, we can
right.
perceive the unity in all things, but also understanding that that unity is an accomplishment.
It's a
The
participation.
unity of each thing is an accomplishment.
Yeah, it's a participation in the existence, right? At the fundamental level, like it's
Work.
Yeah, it's work, it's responsibility, which is why it's called dharma too in the Indian sense. It's something you have to do because the whole entire system is maintained by your acting within the system.
That's right. And I mean, look at the I think the compassion that this inherently gives us for other living things.
Right.
Because living beings, when we appreciate the constant effort of existence, the constant labor of integrity,
right,
each thing holding together itself and holding together its world,
right,
when we appreciate that effort, when we appreciate those labors, I think that what comes of that is a tremendous spontaneous compassion, which is intellectual. It's born of an intellectual striving. And I think that this is what somebody like Spinoza means when he talks about an intellectual love of God.
right.
It's the way in which, by striving to understand the integrity of things, that is just spontaneously a compassion that's not born of a passivity of just a kind of merely emotional response.
That's right.
But there's actually something profoundly intellectual about it.
Right. And the intellect is it's so wrapped up in our emotive response anyway, when you build that emotional structuring, the order, then you start seeing the connections, of the emotional connections that you can have with beings and people.
You look at the word emotion,
animals.
it's motion, it's how we're moved by things.
Right.
And so, it's a phenomenon in the world like anything else. And so that's part of the picture, because it's also a response to truth.
Right, right.
We have an emotional response to truth, clearly, because something moves us.
Right.
And so, we're not moved without a cause.
Sure.
And so, whatever moves us is real as moving us. And this gets back to this notion of Platonism as, everything exists.
Right.
It's like, of course, why would we say like emotions aren't real? If you're being moved, something's moving you.
Right.
The whole point is just understanding what's moving you, And furthermore, it's got to be correct to say that it is some dimension of the object that you perceive as moving you. There may be limitations to that perception. There may be more that needs to be said, but that intentionality,
Right.
the connection of something to that motion in you,
Right.
there's got to be also a kernel of truth in that. And so we're constantly just trying to retrieve those kernels of truth in
Right.
all of our experience. Every experience has its truth, has its yield of truth, its
Right.
intellectual yield, its intellectual payoff.
Absolutely. So in this polytheistic framework, what is the relationship between a god and the people or human beings, or many gods and the human beings? How does that work? Because you did a great article, which I actually thought was one of the most fascinating articles I read about polytheism, because it caused me to change the way I think about the gods, right? The things you said, they're not gods of things, because people are so focused on Apollo's the god of healing, Athena's goddess of wisdom,
Right.
and they think these are fixed categories, like they represent only these things, or they represent, can you explain?
Just imagine if we applied this to humans.
Yeah.
And if we said, well, so-and-so is a doctor, and that's all that there is to him. And so when he's not being a doctor, he must not even exist. He must take off his surgical scrubs and
Right.
just vanish, because that's just what he is. That's what
Right.
he defined by that. The ancients didn't have this kind of perspective on the gods.
Right.
The gods first manifested themselves to them in these experiences that were, like the theophany that Parmenides has. They're powerful. They're kind of overwhelming. They certainly overflow the boundaries
Right.
of whatever kinds of conceptions we attempt to put on them. And so, like in Plato's Cratylus, where he's talking about the kinds of concepts that are implicit, the associations that are implicit in the names that people gave to the gods when the gods first presented themselves to them.
Right.
What you see from this inquiry is that there's a mix. There's an experience of a being who's really other, but then I'm also bringing to that experience my kind of pre-existing categories and the kinds of concerns that I have, and the kinds of also social concerns,
Right.
the kind of needs that my society, my people, the kinds of concerns that they have. We're bringing that to that encounter.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens? We initiate a relationship. The gods manifest themselves to us, and we initiate a relationship. And then from that moment on, everything in that relationship is part of the history of that cooperation. It's part of the history of that relationship. And this is why a person doesn't want to right off the bat say, for instance, that this god from this culture is the same as this god from other culture. Because, even just on a very basic level, you don't want to take yourself out of that ongoing relationship.
Yeah.
You don't want to pull away from that thread. You can, but you have to realize that you're then moving to a different level of reflection that is potentially, really just about our categories, our classification. It's like not every doctor is the same because they do the same thing for us.
Sure.
It's like, yeah, one doctor heals me, another doctor heals me on a different occasion. They're not the same just because they have that common relationship to me.
Right.
There's more to it than that potentially. And so, we just want to respect those kinds of threads of relationship that are established, at some point lost in the mists of history, or sometimes they're more recent. One of the things that we need to appreciate about polytheistic civilizations is that, new gods do manifest themselves.
Right.
And, it's like sometimes I think people, they're troubled by that, or it seems almost somehow, I don't know, absurd to them or something.
Right.
But I mean, in every polytheistic civilization, we see this kind of openness.
Right.
We could come in contact with a new God.
Right.
And in fact, if society changes in really salient ways and our needs change, it's entirely possible, in fact, that we would come in contact with new deities, because they will be there to help us in that transition. They will be there to help us recast our society in the ways that we need to.
Right.
And, they will help us be responsive to the call for change.
Right.
And, this is why these civilizations, polytheistic civilizations, have been so extraordinarily stable over time.
Right.
This is why millennia pass for them like centuries do, for more recent kinds of cultural formations.
Right.
Because they recognize themselves in change.
Absolutely.
They have this openness. New gods come into the pantheon who always embody changing circumstances, changes within the social order.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that the social order has a break and no longer can recognize itself as being a unity with the earlier tradition. If you look at Hinduism, the pantheon has changed a lot over time, if nothing else, in terms of emphasis of people's devotions.
Yeah, you see it with the Greeks, the Egyptians, like Zeus, Amon, like these gods, the cultures when they met, the gods sometimes became like a joint unity. Sometimes they made separate. It was a culture that, the way I saw
all
it,
of these different kinds of options are available, because as a
there was
Greek,
no break. That's why I saw it was.
I could see these Egyptian gods as being, I could see my familiar gods, shining through in them. Or, alternately, I could experience them as completely different and as new to me.
Right.
And, we see both. And, both kinds of options are available to polytheisms. And I think that, it's another kind of important point that, like, it's not like the only reason I can accept or welcome the other person's gods,
right,
if I just automatically say in this kind of rigid way, well, of course, because they're the same gods I have.
right.
What you see is that that's not necessarily at all always the case, but again, it gets to the whole point of multiplicity in itself. And it's like, difference and something new, and this kind of diversity does not necessarily have to be something that affronts me. It doesn't have to be something that I explain away and say, well, it's okay because it's all the same.
Right.
Again, think about it with people. It's like, if I was to say, well, I'm okay with like people from like this other nationality.
Sure.
Because they're the same as me. And it's
right.
like, well, why is that necessary? Maybe it's cool that they're different than you,
Right.
And so, if we look at like places like, Greece and Egypt, in the kind of way that they came together historically, you have people saying, Thoth is Hermes,
right.
But you also have people like just adopting Egyptian gods, and just worshiping them,
right,
and not doing that kind of syncretism.
Sure.
And already with Plato, Plato doesn't do that. It's when he mentions the Egyptian god Thoth and the Egyptian god Ammon in his dialogue, the Phaedrus, he transliterates the names, and he mentions Isis in the laws. He uses the Egyptian name because I think that he's just not presupposing anything. It's like they haven't come to him and told him that they're the same as
right.
As this or that Greek god, and so he's just holding space for that encounter with difference. And that's I think the real beauty of polytheism in a diverse world is
it allows
that
for all of that.
they're all holding space for that difference.
Yeah, they're allowing for the difference to remain. They're allowing for syncretism. They're allowing for it's a very like
it has to do with the encounter with other cultures, and it has to do also with potential change within themselves, because they're gonna deal with that change within themselves by bringing these other forces in. And this is why every polytheism that we look at, the pantheon expands over time.
Right.
It never contracts. It always expands with time, because this is how you deal with new circumstances, is by experiencing those forces, giving them space at the table.
Right. But I mean, just in that sense, it's so interesting to me how like much of the Western gaze on India is the exact opposite in terms of Hinduism, right? They'll start saying, oh, all these polytheistic gods came down to basically 3 or 5, and now they're just, these 5 are worshipped. But I don't think they fully grasp the even when you look at the text, multiple gods are worshipped in multiple different ways, and the practice on the ground is in a village that might have one Krishna or Shiva temple. They have the local god too, Amman or whoever it is, and they worship them equally, and they don't merge them.
Yeah, and I mean, 2 temples to the same deity are not the same either, because even the multiplicity of aspects of a given deity are meaningfully different. The work of that temple is different
exactly
than the other temple.
Yeah,
and
I mean,
so
there's like temples of Narasimha, if you know who Narasimha is, the half man, half lion, the avatar of Vishnu. There'll be one temple where he's in what's known as Ugra form, or angry and powerful, and the other one will be the Shanti form, where he's quiet and subdued, and go to the temple for different purposes and different times.
That's right. Because and that's the thing. It's like these temples, they're there to do this work,
right?
And I mean, without being reductionist about it, I mean, I think it's helpful to see them in some sense as like embodying a technology.
Sure.
Where each of these temples has this very specific function that it's been entrusted with,
right,
as a moment in this long arc of this relationship.
That's right.
With these deities, and they've been entrusted with it. And so the importance then of these traditions, and of not acting like you can just like change them willy-nilly.
Sure.
I mean, it's because you're not just it's not just this kind of bland relationship of respect.
Right.
There's specific cosmogonic work being done. Each of these temples is engaged in a shared work between mortals and immortals,
right,
on behalf of the cosmos,
right.
And they are dedicated to these cooperative labors. And you don't just go in and change some aspect of it lightly, any more than I mean, you see a building under construction, and you say, well, let me take a look at these blueprints. I'm just gonna I'm just gonna I'm just gonna draw in a few things here, and change. We're gonna move these walls around and stuff. It's like, yeah, I mean, you can do that, but you have to understand that this is a cosmogonic work and a relationship with the God. Now, I mean, it's not to say that things can't change.
Right.
But, at a minimum, you have to involve the God. if there are going to be changes.
Right.
And this is the importance of methods of divination, and all kinds of processes and techniques and procedures for getting people into communication with the gods, because there are going to be times when we're going to have to modify traditions. But at a minimum, we need to involve the gods in that process. We need to approach them and say, bring the problem to them and say, we're experiencing this kind of pressure. There's this kind of problem. There's this kind of issue that's come into view.
Right.
How should we modify the tradition?
Right.
How should we modify the tradition? And so, of course, the issue of Sabrimala, temple, which has been much discussed recently. I mean, it's like, we can be responsive to desires for social change, and we can recognize that that things have changed in some salient respect.
Sure.
But I mean, we have to involve the God.
Yeah, that's right.
And if people, the problem comes in when people just go at it from a point of view of,
I have a right.
Well, these are just human practices, and the God is just somewhere completely other, completely disconnected, or people don't even believe in the God,
right?
Frankly, instead of saying this is a cooperative tradition, this is a cooperation between humans and the gods, between humans and a particular God.
Right.
These traditions are tokens of the relationship that have been established over time,
right,
by the humans who were alive at that time and the God who has been alive throughout.
Right.
Now, the humans who are alive now are different than the humans who were alive
That's
then.
Right.
And so there's no reason a priori why traditions might not change. But that's going to be up to the God ultimately. And it has God to be, is in relation with us still.
Yeah, and it has to be organic in the sense of it has to be like, one of the issues I tend to have is with these I guess larger cultural religious issues would be, we are taking the paradigm of assuming rights like we have it absolutely, and there's no right or existence of that deity that we engage with, or that place we engage with. If it's a holy place and there might not be a deity there, there's places like that, right, where it'll just be like a tree or a mountain that's taken itself to be in and of itself divine.
Yeah, there's all different kinds of, and there's all different kinds of the levels of divinities as well.
So, but it is, like you said, it's a conversation, and when that conversation is ripe for fruit, then it'll happen on its own, right? And that, I think, is like a way of
we can be proactive in it. There are means for seeking the God's opinion about things.
Sure.
There are procedures. They can't be undertaken lightly. They can't necessarily be undertaken by all individuals just, right off the bat. They may be complicated in different ways, but there's always a procedure for getting the God's opinion, for bringing issues to the God. And nothing that we do that honors that relationship, is going to ultimately be wrong. I think the only thing that's going to be wrong is if we ignore that relationship, if we alienate ourselves from that relationship, if we absent ourselves from that relationship, that's going to be a problem. But change in and of itself has never been a problem. All these traditions, they've changed all the time, but they've always been informed by the importance of sustaining that relationship. And so, just as we would do with people who, if we were guests in their home,
that's right,
let's say, And, we...
If they say take off your shoes, you don't just walk in, right? You kind of
Right.
dialogue with them.
Exactly. If there's some reason why I want to keep my shoes on, then, we can discuss it. But I mean, obviously, I'm not going to just pretend they're not there.
Right.
And I think that the danger is that we live in a very materialistic society.
Right.
And so things that are invisible, we're inclined to say don't exist.
Right.
And so, this is why ultimately we place so many conditions upon the existence of incorporeal beings like gods.
Right.
Because we feel like inherently, if something is invisible, then it has less claim on existence.
Right.
I mean, to go back to Plato, if you look at Plato's Timaeus, he distinguishes between the gods and things like planets and stars, because he says the gods, in the truest sense, make themselves visible when they wish to.
Right.
As opposed to these other things which are visible in their very nature.
Sure, that's right.
And recognizing the agency involved in that.
Right.
It allows us then to approach the gods with, I guess you could call it a certain humility, which I don't use a term like that to say that our position is, extraordinarily lowly or something, I mean, but just the sincerity.
Sure.
That we would approach any other being with.
Right.
Or at least we should.
Right.
I mean, even other animals,
Right.
I mean, we should approach them first and foremost, not as just this kind of thing,
right?
With an eye toward what we need from it, but first and foremost as this unique being who shares this moment in time with us.
Sure. I mean, like it's interesting. I mean, for me, it's not interesting, but it's my perspective. I myself am agnostic, but not because a lack of experience. I just don't know what to make of my experience. I don't know if it's true out there or true in my head. I mean, I'm still working out those things, and I've been working out. Maybe it's a lifelong process, but the way I approach all traditions and all gods and all respect is fundamentally from a place of respect. I will go in, like if I go to a temple, like if I went to the temple in Greece, or go to a Christian temple, or Christian church or mosque, whatever. I go in with the respect that the institution itself requires me to, and you behave in a way with that respect, because it is a space of divinity. It is a space of sacredness and sanctity, and you have to treat it that way. And you have to, whether or not I ultimately know from a truly epistemic perspective whether such a thing exists or not, I have a sense that there's something real about it, and I don't know what that reality is.
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, I mean, I think that we misapply the kind of questions about reality.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we ask the questions that are pertinent to some physical being.
Sure.
Of things that aren't physical.
No, I agree.
So, if if I hear some noise and I'm like, well, I'm not sure whether this is caused by this kind of physical entity or that kind of physical entity.
Right.
That's different than if I say, this religious experience, what kind of object it pertains to, because by definition, it pertains to exactly the kind of entity and exactly the entity that it has reference to.
Sure. I understand that.
And so, I mean, I just approach these things in a simplifying manner by, again, I always go back to Socrates and these kind of the safe answer. Whatever someone says, however this experience is posited,
yeah,
certainly for that person, at least, that is exactly how that experience is constituted. That
right.
is, and the entity that is referred to, that's posited in that experience, is the entity that's intended. And furthermore, lest we should get hung up on saying, well, it's real for that person at any rate.
Right.
Well, the intention of the experience is that it doesn't just apply to them.
Right.
And so, again, without getting too involved in it, we can just say that, it does intend to be something transpersonal.
Right. No, I agree.
It intends to be something that is related to the cultural structure, and the ongoing cultic space
Sure.
that has been established for that relationship. And so there's not really anything that would lead me to intervene in that experience and say that it's anything different. And it is that simply by virtue of what people have already packed in advance.
Yeah, I tend to approach that perspective with other people's experiences too. It's very it's very important for me not to deny the reality of that. Whether or not I understand it, it's not the point. It's the person who had that experience understands it, and it's real, right? But following up, I mean, I have another question. I have a couple more. I know we've been going for almost 2 hours now, so I want to give you time to have the rest of your day. But what is, at least in your maybe your framework of the faith you practice, what is kind of like the cosmological framework of that? Is it what's the purpose of human beings or beings on the planet? How do we get here? Is all that stuff is.
Well, that's a small question. Okay, that's kind of like life, the universe, and everything, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, we could do it now, or we could do it at another podcast. It's whatever's at your convenience. I have time.
That's pretty. That's a big ask. I mean, I think that inherently, we'll have to get into that in a subsequent discussion.
Sure.
But if I just try to think about it in a preliminary way, I mean, I think that, I would answer this two different ways, but two compatible ways from out of my personal religious experience and, qua philosopher, qua Platonist. I think that qua philosopher, we're here to make sense the best we can of everything that we're encountering, because obviously we're on the front lines of something. Because the kind of being that we experience is this kind of constant succession of novelty, new experiences. We're in this flow of time. And so I think that just given the kinds of beings that we are, our task is to try to make sense of it.
Okay.
Now, then I think where relationships with living immortals comes into that is that, frankly, a being that has a continuous consciousness, a being that is eternal, a being that is eternal in each now, in each instance of now is by definition your companion in this journey. Whoever else is your companion in this journey, the immortals by definition are with us all the time, simply by virtue of the condition in which they live, eternal, everywhere, all at once.
Right.
And so it's natural that we would look to them and that we would discover the nature of being together with them.
Okay.
You know, and I mean, you know, I think you see this beautifully. I was recently reading the Kaushitaki Upanishad.
Yeah.
And the passage with Indra in there, I think, is beautiful. You know, it you know, in some ways it reminds me of something like the Gita. You know, these moments of being together with a god and discovering together the truth of being. This is what we short circuit by the kind of like notion that the truth is just something that that subordinates them, rather than appreciating the value of the truth as something that is really there to be discovered by us and them together, you know. And so I think that for me is kind of how the personal experience and the philosophical project come together.
Right. And you know what? I want to spend a lot of time on that. Maybe next time we can talk more about the framework of the gods and all of that, because I think that's very interesting and very, to be honest, like something that people need to learn more about, because I think it's time for the gods in some sense to come back into the world that we live in today. I guess my couple last questions is, there's so much depiction. Oh, well, first, is there particular gods that you find yourself aligned to more as a person?
Well, I mean, my patron deity is the goddess Isis.
Okay.
And so, you know, I mean, I suppose that I would say that above all else, I'm an Isiac.
Okay.
But I worship a lot of other gods too.
Right.
You know, she definitely likes having a lot of other gods around.
Okay.
And so, you know, I mean, within that relationship, almost by definition, you know, there's an openness to honoring and engaging with other deities as well.
Right. And because these traditions have been gone for so long and their practices have probably not been around, how did you find out about these practices, or how did you develop them? I mean, it's a new area for me. I don't know.
Well, you know, I mean, I think that the answer I would give here would be similar to a lot of other Western polytheist revivalists, that, you know, I mean, you really have to discover it for yourself.
Okay.
And, you know, I suppose, you know, I wouldn't want to say that there's anything, you know, providential in the sundering of these traditions, but I mean, I think it does give one more sensitivity to the nature of that relationship.
Right.
Understanding that it can be sundered.
Right.
From our end, not from their end, but
Sure.
from our end, it can be sundered, and then be very difficult to recover. And so, you know, it gives you an appreciation for the effort of having to discover again well, what do I do to sustain this relationship?
Right.
And I mean, you have to discover for yourself things like puja.
Right.
You have to discover, and I mean, it's like people who are a part of an intact continuous tradition like Hinduism, I mean, they really ought to value highly the sort of treasure that they have of this, intact continuous tradition that,
Right.
that gives you this kind of framework for the relationship already established for you. Whereas in the West, we've had to discover these things for ourselves. And if you imagine coming from a kind of like Western perspective, the first time that you put offerings in front of an image of a deity,
Mm-hmm.
there is a tremendous vulnerability that demands, I
Mm-hmm.
think, of someone coming from the Western experience and the modern mindset.
Mm-hmm.
There's a tremendous vulnerability involved in the kind of openness of that. And I find that a lot of people who may be open in a sort of notional way
Sure.
to honoring the gods, they'll stop short at an action like that, which is fascinating because, I mean, it's not difficult in itself.
Right.
There's nothing clearly difficult about making an offering to an image. And yet, people intuitively recognize the existential weight of it in a kind of a deep reluctance,
Right.
which I think is extremely telling and very interesting in itself as a phenomenon. The difficulty that people have with that, because it's a sign that intuitively they recognize the reality of that they would cross some kind of a Rubicon.
Right.
In establishing that relationship. And it's absolutely true. Because, you establish that relationship, and what you find is that you're not alone, that something answers back.
Right.
And the relationship continues. And it grows, it deepens, it seasons, it matures.
Right.
And, modern people who have been inculcated to think of themselves as the sole creators of their destiny,
Right.
or if they aren't, it's impersonal, contingent, historical factors, things like that. But the idea that something so profoundly other could be co-creating their destiny with them. Mm-hmm. That's a lot for people to accept if they haven't been brought up in it.
Right. I mean, that's that's a lot. I mean, I could still see people I've seen people that have maybe stepped away from their Christianity or Islam, but they still won't do offerings or worship of a deity per se, right? They still find it to be kind of odd and off-putting, and
right.
And it's I think there's something uniquely.
That's where people generally will draw the line.
Right. Yeah.
It has to do with the way in which that affirms the kind of otherness.
Right.
And that's why I think that sometimes, it's easy for people to go along with kind of, the kind of talk about God in this kind of generic way.
Right.
But what is off-putting to people about polytheism is that the gods really have this kind of otherness, of really existing unique individuals, just like if we were to, encounter a bear on the road.
Yeah.
Because it's like,
we're not made in the God's
one
image.
thing, it's one thing to talk about bears. Hey, there's bears in the woods.
Right.
It's another thing to encounter a bear. A specific actual bear.
Right.
That's a different matter. And this is really the difference between just talking about God and encountering a God.
Right. Okay, so I want to ask a last question. It's maybe it's controversial. I don't really think so, but there's a whole slew nowadays of video games, comic books, all focusing on gods, right? Like obviously not the Christian or Islamic or Jewish God, but the polytheistic gods of the rest of the world.
Yeah.
How do you approach it? Do you find value in it? Do you find is it difficult for you?
It's such a mixed bag. I mean, obviously, the gods are present in popular culture because they're awesome.
Yeah.
They're cool. They're fascinating. We're drawn to them, because, one way or another, they've always been with us. They haven't gone anywhere.
Right.
And so, we're drawn to them. A lot of these products, of course, they're not coming from a place of piety.
Right.
And, it can be extremely vexing sometimes to put up with some of the kinds of images that are put forward because of the kind of fear that's embodied in them, the kind of ideological agenda of othering that's embodied in them, the way in which many of them are implicitly designed to, create walls between people and these entities to sort of make it harder, without necessarily intending to, to make it harder for people to think of these beings as beings that you might actually engage with.
Right.
But on the other hand, they do bring people to the gods. I remember, when I was little, seeing Jason and the Argonauts.
Yeah.
Clash of the Titans. These movies did model to me the kind of notion, because you would see people, for instance, pouring a libation, and poof, the god appears and they interact with them.
Yeah.
And so things like that were very important in terms of giving me a kind of perspective then, when I would read myths.
Right.
It would give me a sense of like, well, if I could imagine myself in the place of that person, maybe like, what if I did something like that? What if I opened up that kind of line of communication, and so they at least present to people that possibility.
Right.
The problem then is like, where does it go from there? And the things that I really, the kinds of things that like, make a person, I think, angry is like, when they open up that possibility just to be like, and then something terrible happens, because it's like, these beings just, they're going to use you for their own agenda. You're just like a plaything to them and stuff. And it's like, Well, I mean, hopefully people can just get past that and kind
Right.
of realize that, like, I mean, you could say that, you know, you could say that about any a human who, like,
Right.
for instance, like, does you a favor. You could be like, well, he's got his own agenda, I mean, sure, he's helping me now, but
Right.
what comes next,
Yeah.
and I mean, it's like, hopefully there's a kind of emotional reason
Yeah. I mean,
that people ultimately have that kind of like makes them realize that, like, that's not what encounters with other beings are like,
right.
especially ones that don't have the kinds of constraints that we do, and so they don't have to seek from us,
Right.
this and that, and I mean, I think one of the really harmful ideas that people get from pop culture is this notion that, like, well, the gods are like, they're like vampires, like, needing our
Prayers. Yeah.
offerings and our attention, you know, uh, to exist. Like, we give them reality, and so they're dependent upon us.
right.
And I mean, that's just sad. I think, really, that's a measure of a culture in which it's become so difficult to imagine something giving freely,
Right. Right.
that it says so much more about us than about them, because it's the kind of idea is so alien to us that
Right.
something would give freely
Right.
of
Right.
itself, and not have some kind of, not be doing it out of some kind of dependency.
That's right. I mean, it's then you probably wouldn't like most of the video games out there. And I play video games and stuff, but like I love God of War, the video game. It's really fun and interesting. But it's because I already have the background in Greek mythology and Greek gods. I can kind of look away from the nonsense they sometimes spew on that game.
Yeah,
But
I mean, and I think if people actually can get to a place of realizing that they could bring their problems to the God,
yeah,
then uh, everything, all the kind of misunderstandings would get sorted out pretty quickly.
right,
I
right,
think,
right,
if people could get to the point of actually opening up that relationship, then, those things would get worked out. Because the difficulties that people have in that relationship, and of course, people do have difficulties in in the
sure,
relationship with gods, they are ultimately fairly small, I think, in the big picture.
sure,
By and large, I think that when people put themselves in the gods' hands, they don't generally have a bad experience.
right,
I think, and there's going to be people who are going to give me guff about that. What can sound like a truism or like a platitude,
hmm
from the point of view of someone who's like looking at it from within a constituted continuous tradition.
hmm
It's like when a tradition is completely in flux and it's actually being rebuilt from the ground up,
right,
lots of kinds of questions come up, and people do have very complicated relationships
yeah,
sometimes,
yeah. I can totally imagine.
with the gods, when there aren't guardrails, so to speak, of
Right,
tradition, and people can get in over their heads. Um, you know, if you use the example of a bear, it's like, you know, the bear isn't necessarily going to eat you, but you do have to kind of respect the force of nature that the bear is.
right,
You know, Sometimes people are not in a good position to understand what interaction with a god could do in their lives. But, ultimately my position would be that the gods only do good by us.
Right. Okay. Now, last question. How do you take the term pagan or paganism applied to you, or the new revival of polytheism to be?
Yeah, well, I mean, pagan is a term that people have taken up as a way of revaluing something that was pejorative.
Right.
In somewhat the way that people have revalued a term like queer. You recognize the history of a struggle by saying, at a certain point, yes, I am that thing that
Right.
that you have disdained, that that thing that you have called me and in your mind was an insult. I am that thing. I own that thing.
Right.
But then on the other hand, there's also obviously a process of recognizing that, you're more than that projection.
Sure.
So pagan is a term that it's important to understand the history there. I think that a lot of times people will say that the sense of it is rustic, or perhaps a little bit more precisely, the sense of being a civilian rather than someone who's part of the army of Christ. What we see, I think, to get philological about it is that the term appears to be the Latin equivalent of the term which is used to refer to the non-Christian and non-Judaic peoples in the Greek New Testament, where they're referred to as ta ethne, the nations.
The nations, yeah.
And so, as opposed to the Catholic Church, which is katholikos, universal,
Mm-hmm.
the universal church, these people continue to worship the gods of their nations. And pagus, in this sense, a Latin term which means like a district, it's the same root that we see in like the French word pays, which means country or nation, but also can mean like countryside, paysage. But the kind of essence of it is people who worship the gods of particular nations as opposed to being part of the universal Catholicos church. So the original sense of pagan is in a way kind of descriptive, but it's also reductionist.
Right.
Because of course, people didn't just worship the gods of their nation. But, there's also some truth to saying that, they did worship gods who had a kind of historical relationship
Sure.
with this or that nation, this or that culture, this or that language, because, these gods weren't separate from the world to the degree that, they infused all of these traditions. They were really present in all these traditions. And so, you couldn't just put them aside and say, okay, I'm just doing this other thing now.
Right.
So, there is a kind of a sense to it that's valid, but within the history of the Western polytheist revival, what happened at a certain point was that as the movement kind of reached a certain maturity,
Right.
people began to talk in a more nuanced way about what they actually believed and what they were actually doing. And at that point, somewhere in the early 2000s, people began to call themselves polytheists in order to affirm that they believed in actual gods and worshipped actual gods, as opposed to people who participated in so-called pagan rituals, but didn't actually believe in any gods.
Right.
And so this became a schism of sorts within the Western movement. And this is why at some point in the early 2000s, people began identifying themselves as polytheists.
Right.
In order to like make this distinction. Because there were people saying, well, I'm a pagan, I've been participating in these kinds of like group rituals and stuff all along, and I didn't sign up for anything that involved actual gods. I'm not down with that. And so, there became then this kind of distinction, and it still is a kind of a schism in some ways. And so that adds an extra kind of element of complication to the term pagan, because, I wouldn't be that anxious to begin with to say to people who are part of large continuous traditions, you should start calling yourself pagan, because, there's no reason for them to identify their traditions by anything other than the terms that they've always used.
Right.
All that we need, we don't need to think of all of these religions as being one religion. Hinduism and, traditional Chinese Polytheism and Taoism and Shintoism from Japan and so-called Korean shamanism and all of the indigenous traditions of Africa and Oceania and Australia and the Americas. We don't need to think of these. It would be bizarre to think of them as one religion.
That's right.
All that we need is a very loose, very thin umbrella term that enables us to have alliances to make common cause against, common problems and challenges, and recognize ourselves as part of a family of religions.
Sure.
But not one religion. And so I think that sometimes the problem with using a term like paganism is that it starts to sound like we're saying that these are all one religion. And of course they're not. And so polytheism, it's, the sort of colorlessness of it, I think, is kind of an advantage, because it's just a way of saying this kind of very loose family of religions that just have in common that they accumulate relationships with gods as they discover them.
Right.
That they just kind of go with the flow of these theophanies.
Sure.
And when one happens, they just kind of preserve it, like a flame, they just kind of shelter it and keep the wind from blowing it out.
Right.
And sustain it.
Until it grows.
Really just that kind of relationship is actually what these traditions have in common.
Right.
And, there's just not an easy term for that. I've said in the past that I think that polytheism just is theism. And that monotheism is something different. And, something, in some ways akin to atheism, which is also something different. That polytheism just is theism, because it's just the way of the gods. The name Shinto comes ultimately from Chinese Shen Dao, the way of gods.
Yeah.
And as a kind of a descriptor, and in some other traditions, you will find like similar kinds of terms that just refer to kind of, that religion that consists in just kind of engaging with the gods and just following where that leads you.
Right.
Just going along with the gods, being with the gods.
No, I mean, that's, yeah, I would agree. I'd agree there's a common cause. I agree that there's a lot that could be done if we kind of just build an umbrella and kind of connect together, because there is,
Yeah.
I mean, in some sense, I mean, it's still, with all these different faiths, it's still less than, the monotheistic faiths are very, very insulated in how they approach, all of us.
Every indigenous polytheism in the world today is critically endangered.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Dr. Butler, thank you so much for your time. There's a lot more questions I have, but we're like 2.5 hours in, and I'm like, let's.
I mean, it's like, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak.
Yeah, well, I have a name, but other than that, there's just like, I know this can go for another 2 hours because I have a whole host of questions just on the theology.
I wouldn't have a voice left.
Well, I have a lot of questions on the theology, the Hellenistic theology, and then
we'll do this. We'll do this again.
Yes, absolutely. Is there anything that you want to? Well, actually, before we get off, I just want to talk about your books real quick so that my audience can know them. There's the 3 books I've read, guys, are Essays on Metaphysics of Polytheism in Proclus by Dr. Butler. The other one, he has an article in this book called Ascendant: Modern Essays on Polytheism and Theology. And finally, his essays on Hellenic theology. You should check those out. Get them on Amazon or wherever else.
Well, yeah, and also if people go to my site, henadology.wordpress.com, they can find lots of my work available there. In a lot of ways, the books are nice if people, want, something, physical to hold in their hands, right, and read by the pool, Yeah,
that's right.
I like that pool you got.
Thank you.
But people can read a lot of my work for free on my site. And so you'll put up a link or something.
I'll put up a link to your website,
because tremendous amount available there. Also there, a huge work I did years ago in Egyptian theology, Theological Encyclopedia of the Goddesses and Gods of the Ancient Egyptians, which I'm going to be coming out with in paperback form at some point soon.
Okay.
But it's there as a resource for people, and a really great way of learning something about that pantheon of gods, and it was a real labor of love for me, and something that has become a valuable resource, I think, for a lot of other people worshiping those gods. So it's all available from my site, henadology.wordpress.com.
Yeah, I'll put the link into the video and the podcast. But once again, thank you for your time, Doctor.
Thank you.
All right, guys, we will catch up with you in a week or so.
Gayati